Hi there and welcome to the video. I'm your host John Ivison, and as the parliamentary session ends for the summer, I'm joined by David Coletto, who's the Chief Executive of Abacus Data, to discuss the lay of the land. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, John.
Specifically, I wanted to discuss comments made by the Prime Minister to CBC's David Cochrane earlier this week. Now, Trudeau said, "Canadians are not in a decision mode right now. What you tell a pollster, if they ever manage to reach you, is very different from the choice Canadians end up making in an election campaign." Now, I gather from your response on Twitter that you were a bit upset that he took a shot at the polling industry. Do you think that was the triumph of hope over experience from the Prime Minister, given that your latest poll shows that he's 20 points behind the Conservative Party?
Well, I think he's got to keep maybe some faith among his members and his supporters that things aren't as bad as not just our poll, but pretty much every pollster have been telling him and everybody for the last 6 months. I think it is a little bit disingenuous to tell the public that, you know, the polls can't be trusted when we know that the Liberal Party does its own internal numbers and that the Prime Minister, when the polls favor him or a subject he likes, is himself regularly citing them. So, I mean, I think it was there was so much in that one sentence that got my back up, but I think it is, goes against a lot of what he himself says in undermining an institution. We're not some big, powerful, important institution, but there is some science behind polling, and it did sound like he was very much questioning what it is we do and whether we can do it right anymore.
Well, let's unravel whether there is hope for the Liberal Party. Now, in the interview, the Prime Minister said he will run again to continue meeting the moment for Canadians. But just about every indicator that you surveyed in the most recent poll, which I think came out on Monday, suggests he is out of favour with voters precisely because he is not meeting that moment. When it came to immigration, Chinese interference, the economy, 60% of Canadians thinking the country's on the wrong track. I mean, it did not suggest that he's connected to Canadians at the moment.
He's not, and I mean, there's other metrics. I mean, only 6% of Canadians have a very favourable or very positive view of the Prime Minister. 40% have a very negative. So there's very few Trudeau lovers anymore out in the country, and a lot of strong distractors. You referenced, the issue set. We asked in this survey, what are your top issues, and then followed up with a question that said, which party's best able to handle them? And on the big five, cost of living, housing, healthcare, immigration, climate change, or six actually, and the environment, the Liberals are only tied with the Greens on climate change. They're somewhat competitive with the other two parties on healthcare, but they're either in second or third and well back on all those cost of living or economic issues. And when those are the issues most pressing for people, he's not. I think, meeting the moment right now for people would be making my life easier, building as many homes as you possibly can, fixing the healthcare system as much as you can as a federal government. And there's little evidence in that research that we do that people feel that the government and in fact the Prime Minister is doing a good job on any of those things.
So let's unpack recent political history in multi-party democracies. Is there a precedent for a governing party to come from behind and win when it's 20 points back in the polls?
There are a few. I mean, I asked Twitter to share some, and Mulroney in between the 84 and 88 election, he came back. The midterm, he was 20 points or so, 15 points behind Ed Broadbent, came back and won a convincing victory. Christy Clark in British Columbia is always used as an example. She was 20 points, even up in. Some people challenged whether the polls were actually accurate or not in that campaign, but even within the campaign itself, she was trailing the NDP and pulled off a surprise victory. In Ontario, I always looked at the 2011 election. Dalton McGuinty, he wasn't 20 points behind, but he was behind by 10 points at some measures and came back to win a minority government. But I think, so those are the few exceptions. But there's no perfect example, the one that fits Mr. Trudeau and the Liberals' situation, where you have a government that's been in power for almost a decade with the same leader who's saying he's going to run again, right? In Christy Clark's example, she replaced Gordon Campbell only 2 years earlier. Mulroney was only in his first term, so that level of fatigue and ability to change people's minds probably was different than it is today. And in the case of Dalton McGuinty, he was in a late-term mandate, but he went on air and said, I know I'm not the populist guy in the room. Just the other day, you cited it. Prime Minister refused to even accept that he's unpopular, that people are unhappy with him. And so, there's not a lot of evidence. And I even went back and I tried to find an example of a government in a multi-party system that was 20 points behind. Just being 20 points behind in the polls is extraordinary. The ability to come back from that seems to me to be even more so. And so there's not a lot of examples.
So, I covered that 2011 election in Ontario. Do you think that a common theme in British Columbia in 2013 and perhaps with Mulroney in 87, 88, that the alternative was not acceptable, and so people weren't happy with the incumbent, but then they took a look at the alternative and decided against it? In the poll that you put out this week, 54% of respondents said they want a change of government and think there is a good alternative. And that was up 3 points, which is what you called an intensifying desire for change. But there was another 29% who want a change but don't see a good alternative. Now, there's still 16% who want the Liberals re-elected. If you have that 16% and the 29% who decide against Poilievre's Conservatives, do you think there's still a chance for Trudeau?
I think there's still a chance. I think that fear of the unknown is still a powerful motivator. The one thing Justin Trudeau has going for him is that people know him. Right now, that's not a positive, but it means that they don't need to become comfortable with him again, or they have a good sense of what he's going to do. I look at those numbers, though, that you cite, and a lot of those voters who say, I want change, but I don't think there's a good alternative, may not even vote in the first place. They're not as motivated. And two, right now, a lot of them are still saying, I'm going to vote for the Conservatives. So there's still a chance that the Liberals, and I think they've been trying to do this over the last few months, probably not very effectively because they're not putting much money behind it, at making Mr. Poilievre unacceptable to a large number of people, whether it's because of his, caucus's views on abortion, or that he's going to cut certain programs that the Liberals have brought in place, or now because he's in favor of, opposed to the capital gains tax changes, right? These are all examples of them trying to make him uncomfortable and unacceptable. It could work. I just don't know if it will. And the reason I don't know that is because the examples of where parties have been able to come back because the alternative made themselves unacceptable. 2011, I really like Tim Hudak, but he made a mistake in that campaign by talking about foreign workers. And then 4 years later, he made another mistake by promising to cut 100,000 public sector jobs that allowed Kathleen Wynne, I think, to win a pretty convincing majority government in those two cases. And those were mistakes made by the opposition, and they were taken advantage of. So I still think Mr. Poilievre could make mistakes, could fall into some of the traps that Conservative parties often fall into. And there's evidence in our polling that there's still not a lot of clarity on what a Conservative government would do and whether it would do the things Canadians are comfortable with. And then the last point I'll make is what's new about this Conservative coalition. This 42% of Canadians that they've now brought together, many of them have not voted Conservative, maybe ever. And the only thing they really agree on, fundamentally, is they want change. And so that's where, as you get into the details of what it is a Conservative government might do, that coalition starts to fray. But 20 points is a big, big margin to close. So even if the Liberals are able to take 10 back, I still think the Conservatives win a majority government with those kind of numbers.
Let's take a closer look at the more recent federal history and a graphic you've pulled together on how today's opinion environment compares with similar periods in the most recent federal elections. So in the same period, in the previous three federal elections, we can see how the vote share was much tighter and the incumbent government was much more popular. Even in June 2014, the Harper government net approval was only -2, which I think would surprise some people now. I mean, I remember covering that election, and they were all still neck and neck going into the election. That government was nowhere near as unpopular as Trudeau's net approval rating at the moment, which you have down as -34, I think. Yeah. So this is new terrain for, especially for Trudeau. If we look at the chart, he was net approval rating +21 in May 2020, +2 in June 2018. So very different picture.
Yeah, I mean, COVID, the May 2020, just an asterisk that it was COVID, right? And that there was an effect of this rallying around any government, and we saw all political leaders pretty much benefit, and I think he was still at that time. But I think the 2018 and the 2014 examples are even more prescient, because in 2018, 16 months later, the Liberals, the numbers we got more or less held the same. Andrew Scheer was not a well-known leader at the time. He probably wasn't even at the end of that campaign. But nothing really changed in the course of 16 months. The Liberals and Conservatives were basically tied 16 months before, and they were more or less tied at the end of that election. But the Harper example is the one, and you mentioned it, to me, we have to reflect on, right? Because as that 2015 election approached, it was very clear that Canadians wanted a change in government. They were fatigued with Mr. Harper. The real question was which of the two alternatives would people rally around, and ultimately the campaign that Mr. Trudeau ran was successful at pulling people there. But Mr. Harper was not as unpopular, was not as divisive, actually, as Mr. Trudeau is today. And so for him to reflect on that and say, oh, everything's going to be fine, I'm going to be able to pull this out, I've been underestimated before, I think requires an amazing level of optimism to believe that you can pull it out when somebody like Mr. Harper, who had way better numbers, couldn't do it either. And,
right.
And that's what that exercise that I did, I think, displays, is just how big a hole the Liberal brand is right now.
He did sound like he was singing "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life" as he was nailed to the crucifixion cross. I mean, when you look at just to go back to the poll that you came out with earlier in the week, there were very few bright spots for the Liberals. I mean, we used to talk about Poilievre potentially having a problem with women, but your most recent poll is female voters lining up with the Conservatives almost 2-1.
Yeah, I mean, there's very little bright spots there. A few waves ago, we were seeing maybe the younger people coming back to the Liberals. That's gone again. There's no gender gap in vote. There used to be an education gap. If those with a higher level of formal education were stickier, would stay with the Liberals, were more likely to vote for a progressive party, that's more or less gone. Mr. Poilievre is as popular among university educated as those with a college degree or those that have high school diploma. So all of those normal kind of demographic cleavages or wedges that we see are disappearing, and it now even feels like, you watch the House of Commons in the question period, and we even know that Mr. Poilievre is starting a tour of Quebec. They're targeting Quebec because they see that as almost like the last frontier for them. They've conquered BC, they've conquered Atlantic Canada, Ontario's solid. Now they're going to see, can we make this like I don't even know what super majority, like ultra super majority, right? Like let's go for 250 seats is how they think they're feeling. So that's the other story here, is the Conservatives have far more paths to victory than the Liberals do. And I always remind people that the Liberals barely won the last two federal elections. And these were with numbers in which Trudeau and the Liberals and the issue set were much more favorable to them.
And the Conservative leader was much more unpopular.
Yeah, Mr. Poilievre has been consistently the only Conservative leader, even comparing to Mr. Harper, to sustain a net favorable impression in our numbers. More people have a positive view than a negative one. That is something we have not seen from Conservative leaders. So you just add it all up, and that's why I'm not calling for Mr. Trudeau to resign. I just look at the numbers and I say, how can you look at this and honestly believe that there's a not even an easy path, a feasible path that doesn't see the Liberal Party decimated unless something big happens? And just changing the leader may not be the thing that does it, but it's certainly like the last option, it feels like to me, because the last budget threw everything at all these problems and the numbers are exactly the same as they were before.
I mean, the Mulroney example, in between him being 15 points behind and him winning a majority, he signed the Meech Lake Accord and he ratified the free trade agreement with the US. I mean, these were milestone achievements which presumably had an impact on public opinion. There's nothing like that on the horizon here.
Yeah, no, and I think the free trade election, the free trade agreement was the thing that allowed him to reframe the choice for people. What is that? What is that for Mr. Trudeau? Right? What is the big, I mean, they think maybe Trump winning the US presidency is that. I'm not convinced that's going to be enough, because I think if some Canadians will actually come to the conclusion that maybe the guy that Mr. Trump hates the most in the world shouldn't be our prime minister, right?
Right.
A Trump election could be that moment that causes Canadians to start to rethink, but it needs to be something that big. Because right now they're laser focused on the cost of living, and Mr. Poilievre is really owning that issue.
Pointed out that interest rates have started coming down. There's no clear impact that's had any, or no impact in this round of polling. But if that easing continued for the next 16 months or so, I suppose they could see the reward of that. Although against that, I would suggest there are 2.2 million households who are going to renew their mortgages at a higher level, regardless of what the rates are doing. So is that a potential panacea for him?
I don't know if it's a panacea. It certainly might take some of the edge off people, make them a little less anxious and angry maybe at the state of the world. And again, right now, for right or wrong, Mr. Trudeau gets all the blame for most of this. When we ask people about the housing crisis, more people say it's the federal government's fault than the municipalities or the provinces, who have actually the most tools in their tool belt to solve it. So interest rate reduction might be something that helps. We'll have to wait and see. I just don't know how you turn around the level of animosity that people feel towards the Prime Minister and just the desire for change, that even if it gets better, they may not credit him.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that in the UK, I think, right now with that election, right? The economy had gotten better, inflation had dropped. People aren't giving any credit to Sunak or the UK Tories. And yeah. I think that's because they're just done with them. They've decided.
Yeah. It does feel like a marriage that's gone bad and very, very hard to repair that relationship after the fact. Yeah. David, thank you very much for your time and for your expertise. We appreciate it. Be well.
Thanks, John. Take care.
Thanks.